Good evening. I'm Michelle Foster, the Dean of Melbourne Law School, and it is such a pleasure to welcome you here this evening for the 2026 Miegunyah Distinguished Visiting Fellow Lecture. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're gathering this evening on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to Elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all First Nations people who are joining us this evening. Well, this annual lecture is presented by the Miegunyah Distinguished Visiting Fellow during their stay at the University of Melbourne. This lecture and its associated fellowship were established in 1993 to allow a distinguished academic from an overseas institution an opportunity to pursue their scholarship from within the University of Melbourne. This fellowship was established through the bequest of Sir Russell Grimwade through the Miegunyah Distinguished Visiting Fellowship Fund, one of the many extraordinary contributions made by the Russell and Mab Grimwade Miegunyah Fund to the University of Melbourne. Alongside this fellowship, the bequest included an extensive art collection now housed in the Ian Potter Museum of Art, the University Archives and at the Baillieu Library. And I'd like to offer a very warm welcome to patron head of the Russell and Mab Grimwade Miegunyah Fund, Angus Grimwade, who is here with us tonight and will be joined shortly by his son Cameron. And of course, a very warm welcome to our Miegunyah Distinguished Visiting Fellow, Professor Philip Stern. It is such a pleasure to have you with us, Professor Stern. I will shortly hand over to my wonderful colleague, Professor Sandhya Pahuja, Melbourne Laureate Professor, ARC Kathleen Fitzpatrick Laureate Fellow, and Director of the Laureate Research Program in Global Corporations and International Law, who is hosting and will introduce our guest speaker. I'd like to thank Sandhya and the rest of the Laureate Program team for their support of the Miegunyah Fellow and of this lecture. Sandhya will also offer some closing words following the lecture. But first, a few housekeeping matters. Please turn off your phones if you haven't already. And also to let you know that this is being recorded and the lecture will be available on our website shortly. But now I'd like to welcome Sandhya to the podium to introduce our special guest. Thank you, Sandhya.
Thanks, Michelle, and thank you to the Miegunyah Bequest for making this event possible. I'm delighted to see members of the Grimwade family here tonight. So organising such visits always takes a village, and before I introduce our speaker, I would like to offer my heartfelt thanks to our colleagues in the events team and the Laureate Program team for such magnificent support for the whole suite of events around this one. This includes the ABC Big Ideas podcast that we held last week on the legacies of slavery and corporate colonialism, in which Professor Phil Stern was joined by our own Professor Zoe Laidlaw from the History Department. So please keep your ears open for that one. Thank yous aside, it's always fitting to begin law school events with, as our Dean did, by acknowledging that we meet on unceded Aboriginal lands, and to reiterate the responsibilities that that entails for us as jurists. But tonight it is particularly fitting because our distinguished Miegunyah lecturer has done so much to inspire scholars across the disciplines to reflect on the legacies of colonialism. Professor Phil Stern, I think I'll call you Phil from now on, Phil. Professor Phil Stern is Professor of History at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. Phil is a historian of British and European colonialism. Much of his work is focused on the role of non-state bodies, particularly corporations, in propelling, financing and governing empire. A glance at the world around us reminds us that this is work that has never been more timely. It sits at the intersection of business, legal and intellectual histories of empire, exploring the blurry lines between public and private enterprise and forms of government and governance, exploding the artificial distinctions that conceal the operations of power. Phil's written so much, but two of his books need special mention tonight. The first is The Company State, Corporate Sovereignty and the Early Modern Foundations of the British Empire in India, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2011. That book was awarded the Forosh Prize by the American Historical Association and the Rees Prize by the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. That book changed the way that people think of the East India Company and the colonisation of India in ways that challenge the historiographies of imperialism in general. As that book was finding its audience, Phil was awarded a 5-year fellowship from the Mellon Foundation and co-convened the Sawyer Seminar Series on corporate rights and international law, past, present and future. Phil's most recent book, Empire Incorporated, The Corporations That Built British Colonialism, published in 2023 by Harvard University Press, won the Starsky Prize and was named a Book of the Year by newspapers including The Spectator and The Hindu. It was described by the historian Caroline Elkins as a landmark book, not only because it's so heavy, but also, as Jess Russell put it, because it presents the corporation as laying the groundwork for the modern world. We've inherited that world, along with the tricky patterns and violent modalities that it carries. And as we grapple with the uncontrolled ambition and breathtaking irresponsibility of corporate titans and many heads of state in this present moment, we need the sober and forensic brilliance of scholars like Phil to help us learn about the past so that we can reimagine possible futures. We wanted to allow maximum time for Phil to speak tonight, so we're not going to have an audience Q&A, but I'd like you to join with me in welcoming Phil to speak to us tonight on these vast worlds we can never reach, corporate empires from the extraterritorial to the extraterrestrial. Thank you, Phil.
Well, thank you, Sandhya, so much for that overly generous introduction. And also thank you, I want to add to the round of thanks, thanking Sandhya Puja and the entire laureate program in Global Corporation International Law research team for inviting me, hosting me, and making me feel so welcome for this all too brief residency. With a particular thanks as well to Gabby Del Sasso for making the smoothest visit anyone could possibly imagine, even half a world from home. And I hope my lecture today lives up to the hospitality that I've been given here, as well as by the University of Melbourne and the University of Melbourne Law School events team that's done such a fabulous job in getting this lecture, and as well to the donor and to the Miegunyah Distinguished Visiting Fellows Program for its generosity in making this possible. So thank you very much for having me here. Most of all, thank you to all of you for coming out for what everyone keeps telling me is a really cold night, but doesn't really seem that way to me. But you know, cultural accommodation, I will appreciate that it's been cold and that there was a great sacrifice made by all to come here and listen to what I would have to say. As the story goes, sometime near his death in 1902, Cecil Rhodes looked back on a lifetime of imperial venture with regret. His regret was not, of course, at what he had done as leader of the British South Africa Company, alongside many other companies and government offices alike, in shaping the so-called late 19th century European scramble for Africa. And I've now lost my clicker. Let's see if this works now. Here it is. Got it. There, just take that in. No, instead he lamented, as he put it, that, quote, "The world now is nearly all parceled out, and what there is left of it is being divided up, conquered, and colonized." He then immediately proposed a solution to his depressive woes. To think of these stars that you see overhead at night, these vast worlds which we can never reach, I would annex the planets if I could. I often think of that. It makes me sad to see them so clear and yet so far. Both at the time and more or less in the century and some since, this relatively famous quote, which appears only in a largely hagiographical posthumous biography written by his close friend, the journalist W.T. Stead, has generally seemed to most readers as more or less just an offhand, if not entirely apocryphal comment, and certainly hyperbole. For Stead, it was illustration of his status as a unique visionary and his, quote, exhaustless energy. Similarly, in a sense, though from a very different perspective some decades later, the great critic of imperialism, Hannah Arendt, saw such a sentiment as a quintessential expression of which she called the, quote, moving principle of the imperialist era, a boundless thirst, not bloodless, thirst for expansion among capitalists and the populace alike, mixed here, of course, with Rhodes's rather, quote, more normal capacities of an ambitious businessman with a marked tendency towards megalomania. To be sure, I thought about inserting here that the big contribution to this plan was that I had figured out that Rhodes had in fact gone to space, but it's not actually true. To be sure, Rhodes most likely did not seriously plan for colonies in space, if he even ever said those very words in that way in the first place. Still, they do ring somewhat differently a century and some later, as those vast worlds are shockingly much closer at hand, as there appears to be a new scramble for space. And even the US Space Agency NASA's own library has an entire webpage dedicated explicitly to the idea of space colonization. To me, as someone who spent the better part of 2 decades himself contemplating the concept of empire itself and the role of corporations and non-state bodies more generally in shaping empire, I find this moment perplexing and a bit jarring. There's somewhat of a disjuncture between the kind of colonialism that I've been trained and that I write and train others to think about, and the use of colonization and colonialism in this sense. It's as if we're back in a particular era that's looking at colonization in a somewhat uncritical lens, as something that's a positive mode of progress, rather than as something we need to approach critically, and with an eye towards its impact, not just on the colonized, but also on the colonizers themselves. What also continually strikes me about Rhodes' sentiment is not simply that he was iconic of the late Victorian colonial expansion, but quite specifically one was at the center of an overwhelming impulse to conceive, finance, and govern large parts of empire through companies, such as the British South Africa Company and many other companies, including the De Beers Diamond Company, that he was involved in. One that mixed commerce with colonial impulses and had a complex and varying relationships to one another and to European states, and of course to the rest of the world. It is hard not to, and I am not alone in the current moment of doing so, notice that our contemporary commercial and colonial ambitions to bring into reach and annex low Earth orbit, the moon, and even Mars has again become largely the work of corporations and companies. From the well-known and well-covered enterprises of those like Elon Musk's SpaceX and Amazon founders Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin, to hundreds, if not thousands of others, some with capitalizations in the billions. Much like in Rhodes's Victorian Britain, many commenters and analysts focus their attention on the commercial and financial aspects of such expansion, noting that the quote-unquote space economy is estimated to hit a valuation of nearly $1 trillion in the next few years. Or also to some extent analogous to that late 19th century, we see this as something new, something baffling. Not a quote new imperialism, but a new space race, a kind of neoliberal privatized version of the first mid-20th century Cold War era state-driven one. Those are not wrong. And much like that moment, we observe, but we are somewhat stymied. Because what to actually make of this and what to actually think about the role of these companies is something that we need to really grapple with. I'm reminded here of what Rhodes's contemporary, the imperial historian J.R. Seeley, once wrote about the idea of Indian empire being conquered by a company, which is still apt today, that is to say the East India Company. Quote, "We are astonished and admire, but we form no definite opinion. All seems so strange and anomalous that it almost ceases to be interesting. We do not know how to judge of it, nor what to think of it." I hope today to help maybe shed light a little bit on what to think of it and what to judge of it, and hopefully you won't leave here thinking this is not very interesting. The problem Seeley diagnosed, and which is perhaps still somewhat with us today, is not that we have perhaps come in the modern world to misunderstand both companies and empires, not to mention the modern interstate order, as a world first and foremost of states, and a world in which lines between public and private can be so clearly drawn. It is not that states are irrelevant or that states do not forward the ambitions of empire. However, the history of colonialism reveals a chaotic world of all kinds of actors and agents aside from and beyond the state, whose clear subordination to national imperial stories has been more the work of political arguments and historians than contemporary, that is to say at the time, ideology and practice. I'll be speaking to you about this at length tonight. The second point to consider that I'd like to think about tonight is that even if we accept a relationship between our current moment and that of the colonial past, rather than thinking of empires in space as a new phase of empires on Earth, we need to contemplate the ways in which the extraterrestrial has always been in some ways implicated in the extraterritorial. From colonial astronomy to Rhodes-like dreams of projecting European empire into the cosmos, European empire has long been key to the imagination and facilitation of human interest, study, and eventual travel into space, and vice versa. In other words, I propose to you tonight that European empire, and I'll focus in large part on the British Empire for the sake of time, but it was hardly the only one, and I'm not intending to imply that it was particularly special in this regard, carried with it the seeds both of corporate colonialism and space colonialism. I will make no grand conclusions or prescriptions, but rather simply hopes to raise questions for contemplation, so we might see ourselves as part of a much longer, if extremely complicated genealogy, and one that seems far less strange and anomalous and perhaps gets us further along the path of judging what to think of it. So first, corporate empires. For much of this talk, I will draw on a story I tell in far greater detail and depth in my most recent book, Empire Incorporated. This book tells the story, a new history of imperialism, one which, I say in there, is like a collective corporate biography told as a sort of narrative in which a well-known minor character is put at the center of a story they were traditionally at the margins of. Think Grendel, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, the wicked of imperial history, which is a double entendre, if not more than one. Its focus is not on Britain per se, but the various agents and enterprises that conceived, funded, defended, and in many cases governed over the thing we come later to think of as the British Empire from the 16th to the 20th centuries. Once again, to be clear, this is not a story that was unique to the British, and in fact, from the quote-unquote Dutch East India Company in the 17th century to the quote-unquote French Suez Canal Company, or perhaps most infamously, the quote-unquote Belgian King Leopold's International African Association in the 19th century Congo, one of the things paying attention to companies and empire allows us to see are the fuzzy boundaries and borders among states themselves and national identities. As such, companies often frequently employed a polyglot array of sailors, soldiers, and administrators, had investors and governors from across Europe, bought up other companies, and changed hands in ways that defy any story that envisions national rivalries as primarily or exclusively driving imperial expansion. Of course, I get a little ahead of myself. And to understand corporate empires requires going back even further still. So for those of you who don't think a lot about history, forgive me, but we're going back to the Middle Ages. What is a corporation and where did it come from? This could be a whole talk in itself, but for our sake, and for your sake in moving on, a corporation is a legal concept that did not arise primarily in order to structure trade and commerce per se, but rather arose at first among jurists in the Middle Ages as a solution to the puzzle of how to negotiate rights, immunities, and the authority of various offices, largely those of clerics on the one hand and urban municipalities on the other, within the concentric and layered institutions of the church, monarchies, and empires of continental medieval Europe. The idea of the corporation was that of a group of people, or sometimes a single individual, that could come together as a separate, single legal body being the key word here, a corpus, for mutual self-government, to manage property, and to act in law, file suits, for example, or possess rights, immunities, and privileges, which did not disappear when one member or even all of the members left or died. A corporation was thus something both permanent and always changing. As the 18th century English jurist William Blackstone put it, quote, as the river Thames is still the same river, though the parts which compose it are changing every instance. In the medieval period and well into the early modern one, if you said the word corporation to someone, therefore, its immediate association would not be as it is today, perhaps, with a commercial company, but most likely a city, a guild, a church office, or as it was for Blackstone, a university. It is no coincidence that in Latin, the concept of the corporation is often captured in law by the word collegium, or a collection of collegia, the universitas. In other words, at root, the corporation was a form of government, a means to order associational life and structure the rights and property of groups and even individuals within what were fundamentally nested, concentric, and overlapping political communities. Ironically, however, that same idea that groups could come together in law to authorize an artificial person to represent and govern over them, as well as to carry those rights and obligations, in theory and perpetuity, led to a very different conclusion, namely to the idea of a singularly sovereign monarch, republic or empire, and, some have argued, to the idea of the modern state itself. The concept of the corporation allowed for what the historian Ernst Kantorowicz identified as the theory of the king's two bodies, one mortal, fallible, the body natural, the monarch. The other, immortal, sacral, the body politic, the monarchy. The concept was perhaps most consequently and explicitly articulated in Thomas Hobbes's famous mid-17th century Leviathan, whose frontispiece literally embodied this concept. In other words, the corporation can be seen from its very origins as something that was elusively neither wholly public nor wholly private, and whose legal theory, in fact, underpinned the two major concepts of polity that emerged across the early modern and modern periods. One, we might argue, that if not in practice, at least in theory, were diametrically opposed to each other. One, which envisioned political community as made up of various forms of corporate bodies, giving way to ideas of federated, pluralist, and various state and imperial formations. And the other, in which the political community itself was the artificial person, like Hobbes's Leviathan. Its subjects and citizens part of the body politic, that is, the singularly sovereign state. By the 15th and 16th century, hold on to your seats, we're going to get a little crazy here. By the 15th and 16th century in Europe, the corporate model of governance increasingly found expression in the form of the incorporated company. So in other words, this idea as it evolved over time eventually was applied to a commercial and financial and mercantile institutions, but that's not where it started. And especially, as we start to see by the 16th and 17th century, increasing application of the idea of incorporation to the joint stock company, which itself was, though dating back in some forms to the Roman era and with analogs around the globe from China to the Ottoman Empire, was itself a somewhat radical proposal to structure trade and various other enterprises, from scientific societies to prisons, instead of as partnerships or individual traders operating under the umbrella of regulatory bodies like guilds, rather as singular companies in which individuals purchased or obtained parts of that company, what we might call shares, or in the early modern lingo, parts of its division, or a word that's still with us today, dividends, or what we have come to call stock today, and submit to have that enterprise governed singularly by representatives, something that a representative of the English Muscovy Company, often identified as the first English joint stock overseas corporation for trade and colonization, as something akin to a senate or a company. Many experiments in form abounded, as organization of joint stock corporations seemed to resolve many of the financial and governance issues that confronted overseas expansion in particular. So if you'll indulge me in a deliberately dizzying and rapid-fire few minutes here, allow me just to illustrate to you how ubiquitous this became over the course of several centuries. From late 15th century Newfoundland expeditions through the establishment in 1553 of the Muscovy Company, which, far from just merely being a trading company, once in fact tried to pitch James I and VI on establishing a protectorate over Russia. Late 16th century piracy and privateering expeditions, I was really proud of being able to do that. And corporate plantation projects of varying, it's all downhill from here, of varying success in Ireland and the Americas. A flood of new experiments at the turn of the 17th century, the Levant, East India, Virginia, and Newfoundland companies, not to mention dozens such companies for New England, the Caribbean, and South America, and many, many other much less well-known ventures. Late 16th century slaving and raiding expeditions in Africa, eventually giving way in the 1660s to the Royal Africa Company, the Hudson's Bay Company. There we go, the Hudson's Bay Company, a fur trading and territorial enterprise that grew out of a half-century of collaboration and competition with other English, Scottish, French, and French companies in what became known as Rupert's Land in what is now Canada. Companies that financed and instrumented Oliver Cromwell's designs to conquer mid-17th century Ireland, and half a century later, a scheme to finance land seizures in Ireland that ended up as a sprawling enterprise involved in slave trading, smuggling, and financing the British national debt, and further commercial and colonization projects in Spanish America known as the South Sea Company, whose stock infamously bubbled and burst in 1720. There was an incorporated philanthropic trust established in the 1730s to export ex-prisoners to the colony of Georgia, which in turn inspired in part an abolitionist effort in the 1790s to settle a colony for formerly black enslaved settlers in Sierra Leone. A flood of land companies out of 18th century North American colonies looked to forward claims to indigenous territories. At the same time, that 17th century East India Company continued to expand and grow into a territorial empire which Victorians would consider the jewel in the crown. as the Hudson's Bay Company expanded through its own subsidiary companies alongside the United States. In turn, one sees various early 19th century schemes for company colonies with various aims, including land sales, agriculture, mining, logging, and more, from South America to right here in to nearby in South Australia. And as the iconic East India and Hudson's Bay companies came to the end of their lives as colonial governments in the mid-19th century, any number of new projects emerged on their models, including in Borneo, and ultimately, and most famously, as Rhodes exemplified, in Africa. These models were in turn reproduced in some form from the Americas to the Middle East, in Asia in the 20th century, down to a controversy over a mid-19th century company to establish a colony at the gateway to the Pacific at the Falkland Islands, which would come to a head in fomenting what might be considered Britain's last imperial war in 1982. And that is only just a few examples, only ones again from the British context, that I track in Empire Incorporated, which over nearly 4 centuries is not so much a story about the outsized role of commercial or capitalist enterprise in shaping empire, though such themes are not unrelated. Rather, it is about the long and deep history of companies that for one reason or another got into the business of governing empire. As such, it self-consciously attempts to both challenge and enrich a history and historiography of empire that has long been centered on the role of the state and its agents and agencies by tracing the evolution across these generations of the ideologies and practices of what I call in the book, just a little tongue-in-cheek, venture colonialism. A range of legal, political, and institutional forms of imperial and colonial expansion driven by a core ideology that the very public business of empire was best left to private enterprise, or in the words of the early 19th century utilitarian political philosopher Jeremy Bentham, in his own meditation on a company colonization project for South Australia, a form of, quote, government that will not intermeddle with the business of government. At the same time, the book tells the story of an incorporated empire in a second sense. It traces how the thing we tend to think of as the British Empire proper, namely the one, in fact, owned and operated by the British state, was not so much built, formed, or made, as it was itself acquired through various acts of merger and acquisition, co-opting, purchasing, seizing, and regulating its way to many of its own imperial holdings, from taking over the Virginia colony from the Virginia Company in 1625 to taking over the colony of India from the East India Company in 1858. From institutions and legal claims to colonial jurisdiction and sovereignty around the globe, first established by companies and corporations, among others, that understood that what they'd been doing was neither wholly anathema nor wholly coterminous with the aims and objectives of that state. Recognizing the role of corporations, especially corporate companies, in shaping empire raises any number of new ways of seeing the history of colonialism. It must open us up to thinking beyond national categories, to thinking about the relationship, but also the difference between nation and empire, and to understand that empire itself was not one big thing, but rather always a patchwork of jurisdictional and juridical forms. Here it was not the corporation's unbridled or relentless power, but rather its design and nature to be many things at once. Corporations could be national or transnational. They could be people and societies. They could subordinate themselves to various sovereignties and exert jurisdiction and political power all on their own. They could make claims to both public rights and private obligations, all of which effectively made the corporation a kind of productive paradox that was in essence well suited to confront the paradoxes that colonial expansion consistently raised. Corporations thus resolved many challenges and obstacles to overseas commerce and colonization, especially but not exclusively when united with a joint stock form of capital organization. Corporations could amass greater amounts of wealth and liquidity because rather than simply mobilizing the money of individuals or partners in a particular trade, they could effectively borrow capital from all sectors of society, aristocratic or landed wealth, other trades and enterprises, even illicit activities like raiding and piracy. As a legal form, the corporation could in theory possess that wealth as property and protect and maintain it across generations. Moreover, corporations pass down more than just material assets. I argue in the book that the corporations were especially adept at dispossessing indigenous lands through processes of theoretically, if never in practice, peaceful and legal means such as cession or sale and rights to property overseas, because corporations could accumulate such property, territories, jurisdictions, by buying and selling and inheriting them across places and time. In theory, And not infrequently in practice, this also meant that authority over colonies themselves, at least as far as European law was concerned, could be acquired not necessarily by conquest, but by buying rights to those companies, investing in the companies, splitting them up, or purchasing control of them outright. And in fact, many of the instances I mentioned before of state takeovers of companies actually worked in the sense of, actually required, in a sense, compensation from the state to these companies, not as public entities, but as private property. And so in a sense, the British States Empire was in many instances not so much conquered and acquired so much as bought out. At the same time, it reminds us that whatever the great capacities of the corporation were to collect and transmit its rights, property, and capital, its other great superpower was its remarkable ability to fail, and fail frequently and often. The history of corporate empires is a history not only of conquest and expansion, but unfulfilled promises, phantasms and fantasies, bankruptcies and Ponzi schemes, dreamers and scam artists alike. Historians of corporations frequently like to point out that one of the great features of the corporation is that it was a kind of immortal legal person. Yet, in practice, corporations died, disappeared, and were disassembled all of the time. Some were absorbed into others. Many, as I just mentioned, were absorbed into the state. And some were forgotten, only later to be remembered, as a legal body or a set of ambitions and ideas only laterally taken up in a new form, sometimes by, we might say today, purchasing or reproducing their IP. At the risk of cliche, both in the history of imperial ideas and practice, today's failures not infrequently became tomorrow's successes, and sometimes efforts to reproduce or copy yesterday's successes failed abject miserably. Colonial corporations routinely threw things against the wall to see if they would stick, and they frequently did not stick. This frequent failure of corporations, with a rather unique ability to endure death through the law, made it possible to resurrect such enterprises later. Moreover, in many instances, what corporations mobilized far better than capital was debt, as shareholders effectively lent their capital and sometimes their labor, and sometimes other people's labor, in exchange for potential profit, social capital, and sometimes a share of governance, or as corporations raised monies in other ways, borrowing from banks, issuing bonds, spinning off subsidiaries, in some early modern examples, running lotteries, and many other examples. Far from creating a concerted effort at making a colonial empire, the result was in fact constant competition, dispute, conflict, and not infrequently violence, which I would argue was a feature, not a bug, as they say in the making of overseas empire. One of the arguments I also make in the book, that I don't really have time to get into today, is that it was actually a great proportion of violence among, say, different British companies or different British claimants that led the way and authorized and normalized violence that would then be directed at other Europeans and especially at indigenous peoples. It normalized violence and made it endemic to the colonial project. It provided inertia and ideology alike, while also in various ways authorizing and legitimating the physical and legal violence that underlay the dispossession of indigenous territories, and, if you will, laundering that dispossession across generations through the rather mundane work of the law, from indentures and contracts to shareholding certificates and deeds, to effectively render into oblivion any claims to property or jurisdiction of the original holders. It also created a bizarre but shockingly normalized system where not only could a colony in theory and not rarely in practice be acquired by purchasing a company, but also on a much smaller scale, increasingly broad segments of civil society that could own their own piece of colonial sovereignty without ever leaving home, often in multiple colonial ventures at the same time, something I call in the book portfolio colonialism. This had the somewhat ironic and contradictory effect of both diffusing popular support for colonial ventures by quite literally investing people in their success, while also providing the institutional mechanism for diffusing not only financial and political, but moral risk by allowing participation and investment in empire for many at a great remove. This also reminds us, finally, that colonialism was ubiquitous and central in European history, but it was always contested. There were, of course, many who criticized commercial and colonial enterprises for various reasons, but there were many more that battled over its form. Corporate empire was consistently controversial and never garnered any more consensus about its shape and form than you might imagine in politics today could muster any kind of consensus over such things. Critics assailed corporate companies for being monopolies, for being anti-monarchical on the one hand and anti-democratic on the other hand, for taking outsized risks with other people's money and often losing it, what the 18th century political economist Adam Smith reviled as negligence and profusion of the joint stock company. Many more still deeply oppose the idea of company governments, what one opponent of the East India Company government in the mid-19th century called, quote, the most repulsive form of government that could be devised. The debates over company governments became in turn key to developing ideas about government itself, and debates over company colonialism with other Europeans, indigenous claimants, and especially rival compatriot companies and critics were at the root of many of the central questions that became the core of European international law, from conceptions of non-European sovereignty to what constitutes just and legitimate war. Such debates can be found also not only in treatises, but in treaties, not just at royal courts, but in courtrooms, not to mention aboard ships and in settlements and fortifications, which in turn expands our sense of who counts as a legal and political theorist to those on the ground, either among company leadership or in them or colonies themselves, while also leading many to recognize that even the most famous and canonical of European political and international theorists often also had investments, financial and political, in this world of companies in one way or another. Thus, a growing body of recent scholarship that shows us that Thomas Hobbes's ideas were inseparable from his involvement in the English Virginia and Somers Island companies, or perhaps most famously, Hugo Grotius, whose role as a lawyer for the Dutch East India Company directly led to his famous work on Mare Liberum over the question of whether or not one could claim sovereignty in the seas and oceans, but also an alternative theory of partible sovereignty and of a legal personality for something like the East India Company that challenges or at least complicates his usual representation as the father of the modern international state system. Which brings us back to space. There was also a way in which these debates over the nature and extent of empire, in a sense, played out, not just on Earth, but in the stars. Thinking about projecting empire into the cosmos offered a perfect slate for reckoning with empire in the same way that empire once provided such a slate for people, say, like Thomas More's 1516 Utopia. Space conjured a nexus of science, technology, commerce, and politics in the sense of a vast world to explore and conquer, as a way to both reflect and refract on the earthly experience, and as a way of thinking about, in an open sense, the controversies of expansion itself. Conversely, many of these works over the past several centuries cannot help but connect colonial enterprises on Earth with their imagined colonial conflicts in space, while also revealing to us the casual and persistent understanding that in so many instances, the work of colonizing Earth or colonizing space was hardly the work of states alone. Let me give you just a few examples. As early as the 2nd century, the Syrian-Greek writer Lucian set his satire of Homer's Odyssey, the true history, following a crew on a territorial voyage that eventually lands them through some meteorological mishap onto the moon, where they encounter a war between people of the moon and of the sun over what? Colonizing Venus. The true history in the Odyssey, which you can go see in your local theater, became a kind of model for later for literature over the years, which made its way into the early modern period. In that mode, Francis Godwin's 1638, The Man in the Moon, which you see here, published as if it were a travelogue written by a Spanish traveler, Domingo Gonzalez, similarly envisioned the moon as a next step after its author's territorial travels from the East Indies, the then Portuguese outpost of St. Helena, later a colony of the English East India Company, and Tenerife, and returns from the moon via China. Cyrano de Bergerac's late 17th century, The Other World, or The States and Empires of the Moon, featured a character, somehow also named Cyrano, whose first efforts to reach the moon ended accidentally in the New France of the Compagnie des Indes. While Daniel Defoe's 1705, The Consolidator, or Memoirs of Sundry Transactions from the World and the Moon, required a trip to the moon that was enabled by technology first discovered by the author in China. It is not for nothing that one critic of the early 18th century South Sea Company project I mentioned before pointed out that its probabilities of succeeding were about as likely, quote, as a voyage to the world and the moon, while the author of the 1793, A Voyage to the Moon, strongly recommended to lovers of real freedom, told of a great snake who ruled over a people enslaved to him by use of the, quote unquote, opium wand. The intersecting role of science, private explorers, and companies and empire becomes even clearer as we get into that 19th century world of company colonialism, one that many history books represent as a world of state imperialism. Perhaps most famously, Jules Verne's 1860s From the Earth to the Moon and his later Around the Moon feature a gun club that organizes an expedition to the moon with a clearly colonialist attitude and ambition. While Georges Méliès' 1902 film Trip to the Moon, inspired by Verne and others, features an astronomy club that organizes an expedition to the moon and which film scholars have largely understood as a critique of imperialism. It may be worth pausing here to mention two things. One, that when the Artemis II mission landed, I don't know how many people in the room watched it, a mission, by the way, which was a state enterprise with at least nearly 3,000 private contractors involved in supply, planning, and execution. When it landed, the NASA narrator who was narrating the broadcast announced that, quote, "From the pages of Jules Verne to a modern-day mission to the moon, a new chapter of the exploration of our celestial neighbor is complete." And second, I don't know, again, anybody follows this, but the recent somewhat notorious crashing of a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket into the moon brought that image to mind for me in any number of ways. But to continue, André Léry, a pseudonym for the politician Pascal Grousset, wrote in his 1887 Les Exils de la Terre of a story of the Selene Company and a large electromagnet that was built in French Sudan to try to drag the moon to the Sahara Desert to exploit its mineral resources. Thea von Harbo's 1928 novel, The Woman in the Moon, and her husband Fritz Lang's well-known 1929 version of it, detailed a competition among good and bad entrepreneurs racing to space, and is said to have anticipated a number of technologies and inspired a generation of scientists and policymakers, such as the Nazi scientist turned NASA progenitor Wernher von Braun, who in turn became a key not only to the creation of the American NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, but also consulted with Walt Disney in the 1950s on films to further popularize the idea of space travel. From the earliest days of maritime navigation, of course, overseas expansion was tied to space in a more pragmatic way, as both navigation and conceptions of time depend on the understanding of the cosmos, from earliest celestial navigation to GPS. Captain James Cook, many in this room will know, left on his 1768 Endeavour voyage with instructions from both the Admiralty on the one hand and the Royal Society on the other, a corporation, if not a commercial corporation, with twin goals of observing the transit of Venus, celestial observation, and discovering, of course, new lands of Terra Australis. From there, such work was picked up in other contexts, from the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India to perhaps most immediately here at the Melbourne Observatory, whose great telescope was central in a late 19th century project that both mapped the skies and in so doing contributed to the mapping of territory connected to connecting scientific work across the empire and the world. From the early 20th century, not long after Cecil Rhodes had that fever dream, the mantle of promoting a future for space exploration and settlement was taken up in no small part by private, subscription, and voluntary space advocacy associations in the 1920s and 1930s, all with various relationships to their national states and empires. The British Interplanetary Society, established in 1933, sat alongside an American, a Russian, a German, as well as colonial analogs, like the Astronomical Society of Victoria, here founded in 1922, playing roles of bringing together political, scientific, and commercial interests, not unlike the British and European versions of the Royal Society and other scientific societies that one finds throughout the history of empire, at times promoting an expansion of colonial and post-colonial Commonwealth ambitions, and at other times a more global and ecumenical vision of scientific cooperation on Earth and beyond. Just to note, and it's just to bring us back to the present, by the 20th century, the era of decolonization gave way to a continued reckoning against the backdrop of space of both the growing power of multinational corporations on Earth and the legacies of empire. Frederick Pohl and Cyril Kornbluth's 1952 The Space Merchants describes a world largely governed by advertising companies on the verge of colonizing Venus. And here I just wanted you to see the various different iterations and marketing of the over time, including my favorite here, and I'd like to think of my talk as the revised 21st century edition. Douglas Adams' 1979 Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which Elon Musk has cited as an inspiration of his, but which ironically, in the words of historian Jill Lepore, is, quote, a razor-sharp satiric indictment of imperialism, looking closely, is filled with corporations. Its galactic empire, whose president has no power, is dominated by various fairly incompetent companies and a corporate-esque planet whose merchants have grown so rich under the empire that they cornered the market, quote, on a new form of industry, custom-made luxury planet building. More statist visions of empire, of course, have been an organizing principle of imagining space polities, from Isaac Asimov's Galactic Empire series, Frank Herbert's more neo-feudal Dune series, to the Galactic Empire of Star Wars, which under the surface is filled with companies enabling the empire and a quasi-independent East India Company-like trade federation, an ecology that continues to grow more and more complex with newer iterations of the universe in the 21st century. Perhaps most explicitly, the board game Terraforming Mars, published in 2016, allows you to play as different heads of corporations, competing to make Mars habitable for human settlement. And an expansion pack, Colonies, explicitly offers new opportunities to expand elsewhere in the solar system and new corporations to do it. In this way, the idea of space colonization becomes naturalized through fiction and through game. Or take Apple TV's recent series Murderbot, based on the Murderbot Diaries novel series, which takes place on a space frontier known as quote-unquote Corporation Rim, governed by a conglomerate simply known as the Company. Or From All Mankind, which offers a far more optimistic vision of the future via an alternative history space race that culminates in the settlement of Mars, driven in no small part by a SpaceX-like corporation in tense and ambiguous relationship with a proliferating number of nation-state powers. The idea of corporations and private societies blurring the lines between public and private is hardly reserved for the realm of fiction, or even for fantasies of space. Purely by accident, and the strongest piece of evidence in my talk here happened incidentally. At one point doing some research on another such novel that I had been reading, Ben Bova's Mars, Inc., imagine my paradoxical, gleeful disappointment when I happened upon a website for something called Mars Incorporated, only to realize that what I had happened upon was actually sorry, let me back up. What I was now doing was, it turned out, researching the multinational conglomerate makers of chocolates, pet food, and chewing gum, Mars bars, which has nothing at all to do with space, named after its founder, Frank Mars, but somehow still managed to make my point nonetheless, promoting itself as a global company with the footprint of a small country. Somewhat more controversially, this is reminiscent of what was once a commonplace to note, that some tech and social media, measured by their user base, if not influence, would be among the largest countries in the world. In the decades since, we have come to understand all the better through a number of recent works about the ideologies and attitudes that underpin such ambitions throughout Silicon Valley. Company over country, we're told, was Facebook, now Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg's early motto. To be sure, at the same time, space also became the business of government. For the better part of the last century, in the wake of the US-Soviet space race that became the cornerstone of Cold War politics, scholarship and popular culture alike has tended to think of celestial exploration, let alone interplanetary settlement, as primarily the work of government. Certainly there was cause for doing so. Famously, in 1962, US President John F. Kennedy's famous moonshot speech at Rice University made it clear that it was an agenda to reach the moon to be a, quote, great national effort of the United States of America. Though it is worth noting that in that speech, he likens that effort to the 1630 government of the Plymouth colony in Massachusetts, where he was from, which was the work of a company. Just a few years later, NASA's budget represented over 4% of the US national budget at some $5.5 billion, something like $70 billion today. Of course, parallel programs in the Soviet Union had similar aims and deployed similar resources. Two, as US intelligence agencies were convinced in the 1960s, engaged space for, quote, military and perhaps economic purposes, and of course, the political imperatives in terrestrial competition with the United States. Yet even this picture of a state-driven and state-operated space race becomes even rather more complicated. Immediately after achieving the remarkable goal of the moon landing in 1969, US federal spending on space programs immediately began to plummet. By the mid-1970s, NASA's budget, adjusted for inflation, amounted to only $22 billion, where, with some ebbs and flows, it has remained to this day, which, by the way, is just about the size of SpaceX's annual revenue. Even at its height, the vast majority of NASA's budget went to private contractors, but in recent years, the operation of satellite launches and space travel has itself largely been taken up by private enterprise and contractors, while a number of these same companies, SpaceX and Blue Origin being the most famous, but hardly the only, have developed their own initiatives, from suborbital tourist travel and satellite enterprises to long-term projects for habitation in space, and of course, Mars. With the ending of the space shuttle program in 2011, American astronauts going to the International Space Station were reliant on purchasing seats on the Russian Soyuz rocket. The Soyuz program itself, run by Roscosmos, a state agency turned joint stock, state-owned corporate enterprise, until 2020, when the first astronauts to leave directly from the US in almost a decade did so on a SpaceX rocket. Popular media and scholarly studies alike continue to overwhelmingly regard the growing role of quote-unquote private actors in the space sector as primarily, if not exclusively, a problem of commercialization. To be sure, in the past decade, space has become perhaps the next, though one might predict hardly the final, frontier for economic expansion and exploitation. Have you ever looked up to the night sky with curiosity, wondering what's out there? Recent promotional material from the accounting and consulting firm Deloitte counsels its potential clients. Here's an answer that might surprise you: business opportunities. Yet with great business opportunities, as they say, came great business responsibilities, or at least great challenges for a system of domestic and international law and norms that has, in giving way to a post-imperial world of state sovereignty, left us conceptually where Seeley diagnosed people's sense of the East India Company, astonished, amazed, but not quite sure what to do with it. Take this one rather extreme and infamous example found in one of the most routine and mundane of legal documents of our digital age. You've all done it. You sign up for something online, pop-up menu appears asking you to agree to a lengthy, fine print, quote-unquote, terms of service. There are many lawyers in the room, so maybe some of you read it. I tend not to. It asks you to agree to a lengthy set of, unless you have legal training or very little to do, you give up pretty much around the first or two clauses and simply hit agree. Well, one does this, it's not incidental, and you blithely often sign away profound and not insignificant rights to privacy or data. Rarely does doing this trigger a profound statement of international, if not interplanetary law. Yet this is precisely what you may have done if you've ever signed up for services from Starlink, the satellite-based internet provider owned by SpaceX. For disputes over services provided to, on, or in orbit around the planet, Earth, or the moon, you will have agreed to be governed at one point by the laws of the US state of California, but now Texas, where SpaceX and its main spaceport Starbase are located. This itself is an interesting point of international law about the domestication of these kinds of rights, but that's not the interesting thing. Read to the next clause and one discovers something rather more striking indeed. For services provided on Mars, or in transit to Mars via Starship or some other spacecraft, the parties recognize Mars as a free planet and that no Earth-based government has authority or sovereignty over Martian activities. Accordingly, disputes will be settled through self-governing principles established in good faith at the time of Martian settlement, presumably to some extent and with some influence of the SpaceX Corporation itself. That part's not in the terms of service. Such a claim flies in the face of international law in some objective normative sense. It's a complete violation of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty and of most of the principles that we might want to apply to space. But what makes this non-operable? Mars, like distant colonies in the past, exist outside the reach of states and under the governance of various and overlapping forms of institutions. Such corporations exploit an ambiguous space between public and private, intertwined with governments, but also independent of them. Like SpaceX, other corporations have financial, legal, and political resources that allow them to evaluate and tolerate risk differently than states. As non-state enterprises, they also have different constituencies and, in some respect, ideological frames. Cecil Rhodes may have looked to the stars because all of the Earth, in his mind, had been conquered, and space was next. While others look to space to imagine what the present and future on Earth might and should be, and others look even further to space to escape from what they see as decline or problems on Earth, one way or the other. Yet one thing that has remained constant is that those impulses have come from a world that navigates between public and private worlds seamlessly, as much as it looks to navigate through the stars. I suppose then, if there's a lesson to be learned, it is to recognize that business is never simply business, and government is never only the work of government. And what seems fictional and fanciful today has a habit of becoming the reality of tomorrow. This is, I guess, as Rhodes might have said, something at least I often think about, an insight so clear, but hopefully not so far. Thank you.
No, you have to stay.
Oh, I have to stay? Oh, I'm supposed to stay.
I'm not even going to try and offer any kind of summary of that talk. I am left just with so many ideas, thinking about entanglements of company and state, the idea of fiction and fantasy and reality and colonialism and its permeation of pretty much everything. But thank you so much for coming to Melbourne, for giving us this lecture, and for all of the events that you've been involved in the Miegunyah visit. So thank you very much, Bill. Here's a small gift.
Oh.